The story of the modern world begins with a currency, a piece of paper that became more powerful than armies, more influential than governments, and more trusted than any human institution in history, the US dollar. For nearly 80 years, this green piece of paper has shaped wars, funded empires, toppled nations, and built a global financial order so dominant that most people never stop to question it. But every empire in history eventually reaches a tipping point, a moment when confidence evaporates, when trust collapses, and when the system that once felt invincible starts to crumble from within. Today, we are standing dangerously close to that moment. This is the story of how the dollar became the most powerful currency in the world, why that power is fading, and what happens on the day the dollar finally dies. To understand the end, we must begin with the beginning. The year was 1944. The world was still burning from the Second World War, and Allied leaders gathered in a small town called Bretton Woods. Here, in the quiet New Hampshire mountains, they secretly rebuilt the global financial system. Their decision was simple but monumental. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would be pegged to it. The dollar itself would be backed by gold. And because America controlled 2/3 of the world's gold supply at the time, no one questioned the deal. The dollar became the anchor of global trade, the lifeboat for collapsing nations, and the foundation of a new world order. But from the very beginning, there was one flaw. The entire system depended on trust. Trust that the US government would never abuse this power. Trust that other nations would never question it. Trust that gold reserves would keep the dollar honest. But trust is fragile, and by the 1960s, it started to crack. By the late 1960s, America was spending billions on the Vietnam War, social programs, and international interventions. It was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. Other countries noticed. And in 1971, something unprecedented happened. Nations began lining up to exchange their dollars for America's gold. But when France demanded its gold and sent warships across the Atlantic to collect it, the US panicked. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and made an announcement that quietly shattered the Bretton Woods system. The US would no longer redeem dollars for gold. The dollar was no longer backed by anything. Overnight, the world's financial anchor became a free-floating currency, relying solely on faith. Many expected the dollar to collapse, but it didn't. Instead, something even more powerful replaced the gold-backed dollar. The oil-backed dollar. After 1971, America needed a new way to force the world to use dollars. The solution came from an unlikely partnership, the United States and Saudi Arabia. In 1974, a secret deal was struck. Saudi Arabia, and eventually, every OPEC nation agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars. In return, the US would guarantee military protection, weapons, and political support. This single deal changed everything. Every country on Earth needed oil. And to buy oil, they first needed US dollars. This created constant global demand for dollars, allowed America to print unimaginable amounts of money, and gave Washington unprecedented geopolitical power. The petrodollar became the backbone of the global financial order. But no system lasts forever, and the cracks in the petrodollar system began appearing long before anyone noticed. For decades, the world trusted America's financial system. It was stable, predictable, dominant. But in 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, something broke. Trillions of dollars vanished. Global markets froze, and the world suddenly realized that even the strongest economy on Earth could fail. Yet the US printed its way out of the crisis. It worked, temporarily. Then in 2020, the pandemic struck. The Federal Reserve created more money in a single year than it had in the previous century combined. Trillions of dollars were injected into the system, inflating asset bubbles and weakening confidence in the dollar's long-term stability. Nations that had once trusted the dollar began quietly preparing for a future without it. And the movement that would one day threaten the dollar had already begun. While America was printing money, other nations were building alliances. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa formed an economic coalition known as BRICS. But BRICS wasn't just another trade group. It was a challenge, a direct challenge to US financial dominance. China built its own version of SWIFT. Russia developed its own reserve currency system. India began trading with multiple nations in rupees. And in 2023 and 2024, BRICS expanded, welcoming Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Iran, the world's oil-rich powerhouses. For the first time in half a century, major nations openly discussed ending the petrodollar and creating a new currency backed by commodities, energy, and gold. The world was shifting, quietly, steadily, and dangerously. The dollar doesn't collapse when America weakens. It collapses when the world loses trust, and trust is eroding. Countries sanctioned by the US, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, began abandoning the dollar out of necessity. China and Brazil started settling trade in their own currencies, and central banks around the world began buying gold at record levels, preparing for a future where the dollar is no longer king. Even longtime U.S. allies started diversifying their reserves, because they all understood one thing: a world that depends on America's internal political stability is a world built on quicksand. Every debt ceiling crisis, every government shutdown, every political conflict sends a message. The dollar is not eternal, and the world is preparing for life after it. No empire falls slowly. It falls suddenly. Like a dam that seems strong until the moment it isn't. The dollar's collapse will not come through hyperinflation or total economic failure. It will come from a trigger, a geopolitical crisis, a major war, a sudden decision by a major oil nation to accept payments in another currency, or maybe something far more subtle, a central bank announcing that it no longer holds US dollars as its primary reserve. Once confidence breaks, it cascades. Investors sell us bonds. Nations rush to swap their dollars. International banks scramble to protect their assets, and global markets enter a panic unlike any experienced in modern history. The dominoes fall faster than anyone can stop them. It begins quietly. Asian markets open with a sharp drop in U.S. Treasury prices. Rumors spread that a major oil exporter has stopped pricing contracts in dollars. Currency traders panic. Banks tighten lending. And by the time Europe wakes up, the dollar has already lost 20% of its value. The Federal Reserve holds an emergency meeting. The president addresses the nation. Markets around the world are in freefall. And then something unprecedented happens. Countries begin officially announcing they will no longer use the dollar for international trade. Within hours, a global reset begins. Commodity prices skyrocket. Inflation surges worldwide. And the U.S. faces the harsh reality of living without the privilege it enjoyed for nearly a century. The world will not collapse, but it will be forced to adapt to an entirely new financial order. And life will never be the same again. In this new reality, power becomes decentralized. No single currency dominates global trade. Nations settle transactions in local currencies, digital payments, or commodity-backed units. The U.S. remains a major economy, but its ability to borrow cheaply disappears. Interest rates rise, living costs increase. Wealth inequality becomes even sharper. Meanwhile, countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Russia gain new influence. The global financial world becomes multipolar, less stable, more competitive, and far more fragmented. The transition is chaotic, but eventually, the world adjusts. New systems emerge, new alliances form, and the age of the unipolar dollar empire ends. The fall of the dollar will not be the end of the world, but it will be the end of a world built on American dominance, cheap money, and the belief that one currency could rule them all. History teaches us that no empire lasts forever, not Rome, not Britain, and not even the United States. The only question now is not if the dollar will fall, but when. And on the day the dollar dies, the world will wake up to a new reality it was never truly prepared for.